Welcome to today's Red Talk, and it is on disaster risk reduction. And good to see such a full room, as well as welcome to all our friends online, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Geneva. The world suffered over $100 billion in economic losses as a result of disasters last year. And we are told that just because of Japan and New Zealand and floods in Australia alone, let alone any other disasters which have happened and more to come, this record will be exceeded this year. Disaster reduction, risk reduction is a priority for us at the International Federation, where we believe that by tackling vulnerability, we can build safer and more resilient communities and thereby contribute to sustainable development. Last month, over 2,600 delegates representing 168 governments, 25 intergovernmental organizations, 65 NGOs, parliamentarians, private sector, local governments, academic institutions, civil society groups, and international organizations, and countless others, attended the third session of the Global Platform, which is masterminded by our guest today. And our guest speaker today will share key outcomes from that platform and reflect on future directions in furthering disaster risk reduction in the follow-up to the Hyogo Framework for Action Beyond 2015. She'll focus on opportunities of strengthening local action for resilience through effective partnerships. Margareta has a career spanning more than 30 years in international disaster response and humanitarian work, and she's worked in or on more than 100 countries. She's no stranger to the Federation, and from the warmth of your reception, Margareta, you are actually coming home. She served here between 1989 and 2000 as Deputy Director of Operations and later as Under-Secretary-General for Disaster Response and Operations. Her current appointment is as UN Assistant Secretary-General for Disaster Risk Reduction, and she's also responsible as a Special Representative of the UN Secretary-General for the Hyogo Framework for Action. And before that, Margareta served in the UN as Executive Secretary to the UN's Secretary-General's panel on safety and security, and she's also been the Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator in the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, in New York. And during the initial phase of the tsunami, she served as the UN Secretary-General's Special Coordinator for Response Coordination. I think, and you spent a very interesting 2 years also in Afghanistan as Deputy Special Representative for the UN in relation to the UN mission there, UNAMA, and I could go on and on. Margareta has an academic background in economic history, political science, social anthropology, archaeology, and the philosophy of science. This is what I read in her CV, and I'm curious how she could do all these subjects and do all the jobs and many more that I haven't covered. So dear friends and colleagues, please join me in giving a warm welcome again to Margareta, and welcome to Red Talk.
Thank you very much, everyone, for that welcome, and Mukesh for the in-depth study into my professional life. Don't you know how it all adds up, all these studies in disaster risk reduction? So I think Mukesh has already opened the agenda here. I just want to share with you a couple of things to put you in the mind frame that we are working today. One is last night I was looking up at the sky was very dark. Did you notice that? We had a full moon eclipse yesterday. And that was in the morning. I had been sitting by a representative, I think, of a country that may be here. And one of the diplomats, it was a diplomat, he said to me, you know, sometimes I look at the planetarium map and I think about how, you know, what is it that we are doing to our Mother Earth? So I offered him the idea that the first planet that we can actually move to is Mars. And I could see he wasn't quite into that idea. But as many of you know, that is not an entirely unrealistic perspective. It is physically feasible, maybe not financially yet, but when it gets tight enough, maybe that's where we will start heading off. So I will end my session today by asking for volunteers. Now, my second personal reflection is about a year and a half ago, after I had done this job for, as you can understand, I come from a much more hands-on disaster response management experience. So some of my colleagues in the UN system, they once said to me, you must have the most difficult job in the world. Just keep trying to convince people about doing something that is so eminently wise, and no one will say you're wrong, but you can't get them to do it. So, you know, how do you keep going with these things? I told them that I felt that I had come into this job in a very, very interesting moment, and that there is, for the first time, I sense that we are no longer talking empty talk about prevention, preparedness, but that we are seriously into a situation where countries, individuals, people, communities, organizations are actually getting very serious, and I will tell you a bit more about that. Then, to complete my study, I did a word search in your strategic plan for disaster risk reduction. There's not a lot of it there. Mukesh claims that it's disaster, risk, and reduction is sprinkled through it. So I think we should set the objective maybe of merging them together and thinking about what we can do to get a strong sense of what I know that you're all very interested in, is to get it in there. So coming from what someone just called the mother of disaster risk reduction, which is obviously not me, but the global platform, I think, no, that was not a joke. I can tell you, and I'd like to share with you here in the next 20 minutes, I feel really encouraged and motivated by the outcome of the platform, by the focus of the 2,600 or so people who were there, and the fact that in the platform we did not only have the Secretary-General, but also the President of Indonesia agreeing to be the global champion for leading the quest for political leadership on risk management in the world. And yesterday I had the opportunity to meet him in person, and I could really verify that he is very, very seriously onto this track. So that's just to show you where we're coming from. Now, why is disaster risk reduction so important? Why is risk management so important? I'll just give you, Mukesh mentioned some of the figures, but let me just give you a couple of examples for those of you who are not following this on an everyday basis. You know that our cities are growing. You know that the number of people is growing. On this earth, we are getting to very interesting numbers now. 20 years ago, no one liked to talk about population pressure. Today, everyone is saying, we have a lot of people. It's a wealth, but it's also a real challenge. Because why? Because it challenges our resource base. And where are these people living? Well, you know, already today more than 50% in cities, the most quoted figure ever. But what is more dramatic for you, that very soon 70% will live in the cities. In Central America already in some regions 80% are living in cities. In Mexico I think you have almost everyone living in the cities. And there are enormous consequences of this in risk management, also positive economic opportunities. That's why we want to live there. So what are the threats and risks to this? Well, apart from the fact that many of these largest conurbations are sitting exactly on seismic fault lines, and some of these cities, like Dhaka in Bangladesh, have just begun to focus on it because they've been so preoccupied with the obvious floods and cyclone. And now Dhaka is beginning to work on the seismic risks. And for all of you who have been to Dhaka, you know that this is an almost insurmountable task. The other one is extreme weather events, climate variability. You hear I'm quite concrete here. And you already know it is scientifically verified if you want to challenge it, but you just need to sit at the practice end of increasing flooding, increasing extreme weather events, cyclones hitting coastlines. I don't need in this audience to give you all these details. What I would like to tell you is, as the world's population grown from between 1970 and 2010 with 87%, the population that has increased in highly vulnerable flood basins has increased with 114%. And people living on cyclone-affected coastlines with 193%. So what does it tell you is that we concentrate all our economic activity, all our cultural activities, all our lifestyles in the most highly vulnerable areas in the world. And there is really no very strong sense of control of this, because no one politically responsible can put a stop to this. So the other perspective is, of course, we have to understand better what are the consequences and how we can challenge them. That's why you hear us in the disaster risk reduction community talk so much about economics right now. Many of you have been around long enough, you know, in the beginning, let's say 30 years ago, when the shift started happening gradually, saying, you know, disasters are coming too frequently, hitting the same communities over and over again. Surely there must be a better way of dealing with this. Let's look at how we can educate, create awareness, mitigate, build better infrastructure, move people out of harm's way. Let's not repeat the mistake. If a school is struck down every other year in the same place, don't rebuild it in the same place. But these things were not terribly obvious, strangely enough. The World Bank discovered that they kept making investments in the same things until one day they said, well, maybe we shouldn't actually finance the rebuilding of this bridge in the same place. It's not a very sophisticated process we have gone through. The hospital in Grenada that Mukesh financed when he was in DFID, where they made a field study saying, don't rebuild this hospital in this place because it's going to go under the volcano. The hospital was built and it went under the volcano. That case study is still in DFID's bookshelf, you told me. So the human lack of wisdom and insight is, I think, one of our main challenges if you look for challenges. So we went from the humanitarian understanding to definitely investing a lot in preparedness and early warning system. And then we pushed the agenda, and many governments, I'm sure executive leaders also say, well, can you really show us that the cost-benefit is good enough of this? That started maybe, I would say, approximately 10 years ago. We really went on the economics. And of course, we hadn't done our homework, none of us. So now, luckily, there is a lot of attention to this. And the homework was done by governments in many cases, 30, 40 years ago. It's just that the international system has not consistently gathered. One of our always consistently big mistakes, we always look to our own learning before we go to governments, instead of asking governments, what do you know about your cost-benefit ratios? Let us use that to make the case to other countries. So here we are today. I must confess that right now, when asked this economic argument, when I do have the data, nevertheless, I always ask the question, if the cost-benefit ratio is not good enough, are you going to do nothing? Just to challenge that over-economic view on the responsibilities of governments and corporations. So in that dialogue, let me just tell you a few of the risk trends. The biggest direct risk, the costliest of disasters, have to do with weather. In any given year, 80–95% of any losses and costs are linked to floods, cyclone. And that will continue to increase. That's one of the biggest threats. You can say it's climate change is a driver, but not necessarily a cause, because we say we have choices. If we look at today what the trend has been over the past 30 years, just let's remember a few facts. In East Asia, the region in the world that is most prone to cyclones and flooding, because so many people live there and they're so exposed to these weather events. The losses and the death rates from these disasters have gone down drastically, simply because governments have invested in preparedness and early warning systems. In Vietnam, people are evacuated. All these things work. It just works. In the rest of the world, the figures are not going down, they are still increasing. The exposure to countries in the Caribbean, Latin America, West Africa keeps increasing, so the economic losses are going up, the loss of life keeps going up. Second thing to keep in mind that it's been a very dramatic past 18 months with the cycle of disasters in all countries, and I think it's a positive thing because it has really finally bridged the gap that disaster impact and losses is something that only concerns poor countries. No, it concerns all countries. And the region that has the lowest risk awareness in the world is Europe. And we are still just crawling along a little bit, but it is getting better. I will give you an example. What's for me the measure why Europe is so slow here? Not only because the perception of that wealth protects you against risk, but there is a fund in the European Union that is only intended for European countries, which has lots of money for them to pick into for strengthening of local protection system. And this is the lowest take-up of all the funds in the European Union. It's like local governments haven't quite figured out that this is a huge opportunity, it's there for them, central government needs to decide, but for some reason the awareness and the interest in this is extremely low. Unfortunately, this is not available outside Europe, but it's just an indicator of that Europe need to be much more focused on this. So what about risk? It's going up in all countries. It is from floods as an example. All countries are seeing the potential risk going up and the cost of that. And in some countries, the potential losses from risk are growing faster than the growth of GDP. So in other ways, we are actually growing our economies, but we are losing more than we are growing them from the accumulation of risk. Now, what accumulation of risk is not a disaster realized, it's a potential one. So it's our infrastructure, it's the way we manage our water assets, the way we manage agriculture. It's all this accumulation of modern lifestyles that is accumulating so fast. Dramatically enough, in low and middle income countries, because their economies are growing a lot faster than ours, sort of 3 minutes, not 3 minutes, 5 minutes, but they are on a trajectory of, whereas in Europe, Sweden grow maybe 3% economy. Many countries today are growing in Africa, 5-7%. East Asia, it's up to 10%. So there, it outstrips the whole perspective. So with that perspective, the total GDP exposure in any year is today is 265% of GDP, totally. In OECD countries, they are much more exposed than the rest of the world. The total of all the global exposure, 53% is lodged with the OECD countries, the richest countries in the world. So that's the picture we have. And I would like to say that if we need to look for a rational reason why we need to manage risk and reduce risk, it's all there, because everyone's future is at stake. A particular message regarding the MDGs, the Sustainable Development Commitments. I'm in a world where we all stovepiped into some people work on development, others environment, others on climate change, others on the financial structures. I think our challenge is how to talk to each other. So we see as a part of our job to figure out how that glue between the major sectors, how it can be expressed. And here is something that I would like to offer you is, if we want to extend our commitment to not only sustain development, but also sustainable and equitable development, if we don't plan that according to the three big risks. And what are the three big risks? It's climate risk, it's disaster risk, and our inability to deal with pervasive poverty. Everything else, I think, diminishes if we cannot manage these three things. So the message is, in summary, we have to know our risks. We know what to do about them. But it's not you and me individually who can necessarily. We have the technology, we got the information, we got the political instruments in most countries. We now have local governments are mobilized, parliamentarians are mobilized, children are mobilized, the health sector people are mobilized. So why aren't we sort of pulling it together? What you will hear from us over the next few years is reaffirmation of the economics, reaffirmation of the risks. We'll keep counting. But we also say political leadership is not the main. It's political and executive leadership. Disaster risk reduction is not a technical issue. It is also a technical issue. It's a strategic framework for what you do. Frame it around your development thinking, frame it around your environmental efforts, frame it around your national administration structures. Even the best countries have not quite yet got to that. Some of you may be familiar with the midterm review of Yoga Framework for Action. In fact, Federation made a very good contribution to the midterm review. And the midterm review came out and said, yes, there are challenges, this and that, there are challenges, but the main challenges are actually about institutional issues. It's very sad. It's like saying that the best investment to reduce risk is planning, planning, planning. This is what the mayor of Christchurch said. He came and spoke to us once after the first earthquake in New Zealand. And people asked him, he's an excellent speaker. They asked him, what do you suggest we do? What is the best instrument? And he said, planning, planning, planning. Now, architects and land use planners, they love this. But disaster managers, they think this is really quite uninteresting. So if we could also safeguard ourselves against this culture of always coming with new things. Actually, sometimes old, well-known, tested technologies are the right ones. So know your risk, collect data, establish a risk baseline, understand that without knowing the risks in your local environment, you cannot plan to mitigate risk. Risk is actually a global issue. It has no borders, but it can only be mitigated at local level. And it's only by empowering local level, by ensuring that local governments, local organizations have resources, people, partnerships, and engagement that we can make a change. What about really some non-tangible challenges? I think our individual and collective risk perception is a problem. And I will not dwell a lot into that. There are books and books about it, but I ask you to think about how you yourself think about your risks, your daily risk, your insurance of your cars, your insurance of your house, and then you multiply that into society perspective and think about how do countries manage risk? Why are they, if you think risk averse, why do they avoid making certain long-term investments? So these are, when we criticize others, let's think about ourselves a little bit, how we behave. Then we understand what are some of the barriers to getting the right decisions. And when we understand those barriers, we can work our way to both the political and technical areas. The final issues that I'd just like to share with you is how, from the economics, disasters cause social instability. Many of you have faced that yourself. But these days also disasters and their magnitude, they cause political losses. Ministers lose their jobs, governments are destabilized. In fact, many countries do have legislation that hold senior officials accountable for not mitigating things. There are court cases. So just that actually verify that position. So think about where we're going now in the next 10 years. Just imagine the first class action suit in United States, where a whole community will say we hold the government responsible for not having ensured that the dikes in Louisiana work. So I'm just trying to think ahead, how are we prepared for meeting that types of very high level issues? We need to very fast grow out of sort of the environment where we are now and meet governments at the level where they are now. Because my conclusion from my past few years in particular is that governments are far ahead of the international system on this. So it's not so much a question of what can we do for them, except giving visibility to the issues, putting it on the political agenda, but how fast can we learn and accumulate what they have accumulated and make it available to the many countries and communities that are now faced with these issues. What did the global platform actually put firmly? It was very much about local government. It was about precisely the issues I've talked about. We have to start measure the potential losses. We have to measure risk. How do you measure it? Well, we have some participants here who are starting to do that. But you need to measure disaster losses. Still, this is a very scattered issue. We are still using the CRED database to talk about disaster trends. We are not yet down to really understanding the scale of disaster cost every year. And here, in terms of where the Federation can help, here is something that I think with the assistance of national societies, they have such access and such overview over what happens at local level through all the district and branches. If this is something you wanted to contribute to, I'm sure you can. Secondly, so measure. Support local governments and local administrations, never mind they have different countries, but support them in driving the policy and programmatic agenda. It's about public investment. It's about not always assuming that disaster risk reduction costs a lot more. It's as often about how you do things slightly differently in a more insightful manner. It's about tracking. All these are recommendations from the global platform, so you have full access to it and follow it up. It's about tracking how disaster risk reduction is evolving so we can measure impact, because impact will give you more resources. For the first time these days, I hear donors insisting on that the international system invest in better preparedness. That has been our big challenge for a couple of decades. Now we are there. Now we have to be able to pick it up. Also, from our side, a clear call, support better the national platforms for disaster risk reduction. Many national societies are actually part of these national platforms. So what can we together do to better support these multi-stakeholder national entities that are not decision makers, but they are important advocates, knowledge bases, and they do influence policy. In some countries, they've even started establishing local platforms. And I'm sure Red Cross districts are part of that. And my final, there will be more details, but the one consistent call, I am a bit surprised myself, to be honest, but the one consistent call I get everywhere, every part of the world, every meeting is we need more public awareness and education. More. Essentially what they are saying is you have to keep repeating, and of course clear, simple, it has to come from an authoritative source, it's not entering into any debate, but it's talk about the risks, how you anticipate, how you mitigate, and what are critical areas. We cannot mix everything. But wherever I go in the world, quite frankly, this is the main message. The reason why I say I'm a little bit surprised myself, because like many of us international civil servants, we are a bit cautious about these things. You say, you know, this is so national specific, can't you do it at national level, etc. So the message I get back is say, well, we will do that, but we need the support of the international system to drive the agenda. We want to be part of a big global movement that drives awareness raising and learning and access to information, a critical area where I would imagine that the Red Cross can also contribute very consistently. Easy access to interpretable information that allows people to take their own decision. And our big, one of the great breakthroughs that I hope a lot for in the years to come is the engagement of the private sector, linked not least into access to information. Why? Well, not because, I'm saying this, but not because I want their money. That's not the primary objective. No, the private sector, the private economy is 80% in most countries in the world. But public investment is through the government budget, is 3 to 15% on the average in any country. So the rest of the investments in infrastructure and the economy is private sector. So my argument, if I cannot get the private sector to commit to reduce risk with us, we don't have a chance. Doesn't matter. So that's the way we've drawn them in, and we have a very enthusiastic private sector group, quite small, but they have made it their job to expand this group with thousands and thousands of new corporations over the year. And what we ask for them is expertise, knowledge, put into the public space for learning. And if they want to give money, yes, they should give money, but they should give them to local governments, to organizations that make a difference. And then if there's some money left, of course, I don't mind getting it, but really that's not our advocacy. The advocacy here is for your future, for the future of your economic profits, for the future of your clients' health. Please join us to reduce global disaster risk. So that's my message also to the Federation, of course. I reminded Mukesh that in 2007, when we had the first global platform, that was the first time he worked for the Federation as employee. And he made a big commitment to the global platform that the whole Red Cross, Red Crescent movement stands behind you. And then I heard nothing for a year and a half. And then he came back. So now I know that we are already working on many specific areas, and we have both direct cooperation with many of you, and we hope for a lot more. So thank you for your attention.
Very interesting you said about political losses. This is certainly a new phenomenon. And I couldn't help wondering, somewhat irreverent thought, whether any heads of institutions have also had their heads off because of failure to deliver and failure to actually move forward. And I thought it was interesting what you said, that how many governments are in advance of the international systems that are there to support them in their work. I think the whole architecture is changing, the nature of the relationship between governments and the international system of which they are a part, and of course citizens and civil society. So that whole kind of system of interrelationships is no longer necessarily the very traditional relationship that we see. And we saw that, did we not, those of us, we had a strong Red Cross team also this time at the global platform, where we saw the thousands of people who were there from all over the world.
Question for Marco from Haiti. He says, I think that the institutional issue is even more problematic when operating within a metropolitan area where the government structure has been affected by a severe disaster. Enhancing coordination mechanisms among organizations and between organizations and governmental authorities becomes even more problematic. I think that this is a subject to be more deeply discussed to find out how to be prepared to cooperate with governments when they're not capable to be an appropriate counterpart. Which are your comments on that?
We all know that Haiti's institutions are not only weak, but they've been weakened consistently for the past 60 years. So it's critically important that I would say you always have to work with government, otherwise there is no sustainability in what we do. So I have always, in every job, not just now, say that, you know, it's part of your job to find a way to work with the government, whatever shape it is in. And the positive message now is we have a new government in Haiti, and any new government takes a bit time to find its feet. But I can tell you that one of the first things that happened after this government was in place was they started looking at precisely their risk reduction and risk management structure. So we had a request to get our staff member who was there supporting them up to the earthquake, and in fact after that he was asked by UNDP to quickly go to Haiti to help them to draw up a new plan. So I think the message is that this government has taken the opportunity of being new to say this is an important issue for us. And I hope they convey that to all the international partners in Haiti so that, you know, facilitate that conversation.
It was good to hear you express some confidence, if I understood you, still in the network of national societies and the contribution they can make. 10 years later or so, after you were working with us, what would you do differently if you rejoined and had Mukesh's or my job?
Differently from what?
From 10 years ago, or differently from what we are doing? I mean, you challenged us in terms of not following through commitments.
Yes.
You know, and I personally would say part of the challenge here is being a network of sovereign, independent national organizations that are difficult to influence from the global level. So it's around this relationship, global, national. Would you do anything differently with the benefit of?
The way the UN and the Federation has the same challenges is maybe on a different scale. And but it's political in the relationship. It's between the balance between respect, you know, the sense of sovereignty, and setting clearly its own priorities, and how to define the role of the international system. And I think Mukesh just reflected that, you know, there's no doubt to me that not only 10 years, but that has been a dramatic period of shift in the tectonic plates in the world. Where is the world leadership? You know, many of you, I'm sure, get the strong sense that China is like a magnet today. There's sort of vacuum cleaning knowledge, experiences, engagement, and really wanting to be there. Whereas, in fact, in an earlier conversation today, some of the countries that we are used to, both from a policy perspective and political influence, from Northern Europe, used to be very present and heavy in the UN life and also in the Red Cross life. They're sort of retreating from this. And other countries are stepping in and weighing off in other directions. And you have the same thing in the Red Cross, I'm sure. So that's really one big difference. So when you look for partnerships for change, it's our role in relation to countries or societies is, and this is a big change for the UN as well, is really finding it. Where is our added value? How do we weigh in to what countries already are? You know, how do we help to influence? Because there are difficult issues everywhere, but we really have to choose our instruments and approaches quite carefully if we are going to have an impact the way we influence. And I know of senior people, the UN system, the resident coordinators, who are working in countries that are more than middle income. You know. In fact, in Mexico, we had which is an OECD member country, we had before a resident coordinator who was very discreetly but very importantly involved in advising the government on a democratic process for defining electoral systems. And this is not uncommon, but of course this is not what they flag. This is not what he was sent there to do. It's because they found him useful, he had the knowledge. And I think one of the problems we have as international system is we have got too many things on our agenda. You know, we believe we need to be involved in everything. I don't think so anymore. I think the competence is very often outside our own organizations. And we need to very wisely either advise the users to buy the services on the market, because very often they have money if it is a priority. So we need to be much more thoughtful in this relationship and not always automatically assume that we are the ones that can offer the technical advice guidance. And I'm particularly cautious when it comes to our area of risk management, but everything that has to do with this is what technically do we have to offer? What do instead the risk insurance business have? I remember one of the examples, if I can give you an anecdote. One of my former colleagues, he used to work in a big state in middle North India as a UNDP-funded disaster risk reduction expert. But I think he originally came from the government of India somewhere as a civil servant. So he designed with this government a very interesting, very appropriate program defined to their needs. And the UNDP had mobilized a lot of money, good, to pay for this. But the government says, we don't need their money, we'll pay for it. Because it was relevant for them, they did have money, and it was their program. And that's where I would like us to be, is that we are so good for the people who need something from us, that they make it their priority. Because that's why I keep talking about budget allocations and investment, public investment. It's not our investment, it's country's investment. I'm not excluding that our money is not valuable, but sometimes I think we overvalue the value of money and not value enough the value of wisdom, political clout, partnerships and networks.
What Margareta is challenging us is that this is a completely different way of working. When monopoly of knowledge or wisdom does not necessarily reside in one place, least of all in global institutions, when there is actually a new kind of self-determination to take responsibility for your own hands, and thus must surely be a good thing for for development, then it requires a very, very different and much smarter way of relating and working, and not necessarily always a very comfortable one either. Much easier to give aid and to have grateful recipients of the aid. Much more difficult when the aid giver actually bites your hand at the same time and sort of is not so grateful.
It's Mr. Javier Castellanos, who's the Federation's director of the Americas Zone. He says that the disaster in Haiti is the consequence of decades of failure of governments and the international cooperation. If there are three things that you will recommend to the government of Haiti, the UN community, the banking system, and the Red Cross Red Crescent, what would it be in the framework of disaster risk reduction?
And this message we try to convey in a little bit longer than necessary, maybe chaos in Haiti last year. From the UN side, we had already done the analysis of how ODA has been used in Haiti. I'll talk about accountability here. We looked at the CCA, the UNDAF in Haiti, and my colleagues from the World Bank, they looked at the PRSPs and the country assistance strategy. So we said, what did they say there about prevention and risk reduction? And if they said something, how much money did they put against it? And if there was money against it, how much did donor actually give them in response to that? The result was miserable, I can tell you. So there is a lot of, quite frankly, talk and not enough walk. So that has been a bit our message since then. We've said the total ODA to Haiti, that is all the donors, most of them who say that risk reduction is really a very critical issue for them. Maybe not very simple for them to program it, but they had a moral and political commitment. They have not used that to turn it into programmatic considerations, nor have they used this as an incentive to countries to do what we think is really necessary to do. So for Haiti, that's my recommendation, is that all of you look into your country assistance strategy. You make sure that you don't contribute to rebuilding houses, schools, clinics in a miserable manner. That immediately took off. Everyone said rebuild safely. They did not rebuild safely. There's already a number of scandals emerging out of there. to now look at the future and don't ever contribute to the marginalization of governments. Because, of course, the international community in Haiti has almost consistently done that because they were frustrated, weak government, etc. We completely ignore the local governments in Haiti. Now they have been refound. I see many relationships being built. But between the local and the central government, there has to be something. Otherwise, the system is equally inviable. So that would also be my encouragement, that do not accept shortcuts in a country like Haiti that really needs to do very differently. And there are many other countries that are really very poor and do not have resources, but they have a much more determined governance structure. So there the cooperation may be easier, but for Haiti, I think it requires really something very special from all of us in not to make these compromises.
Erling from the Norwegian Red Cross, he would like to know, do you see the Red Cross, Red Crescent as an important tool in disseminating information on climate change and risks in connection with the global framework for climate services and similar systems?
I visited your Red Cross camp with 59 Red Cross societies or something like that a year ago. Well, accountability. I don't think accountability is easily translated into a collective sense of accountability. It needs to start with individuals. So start first. How quickly do we give up? If you design a good disaster risk reduction program and you give it to maybe not Mukesh but one of the senior managers here, and they said, well, this is not interesting for donors, take it out and just present it as you used to. That's where my accountability starts. We really have to fight for some of these things. I think now we are in a better period, but 10 years ago that was very easy to do. Preparedness, no one wants to pay for preparedness, take it away, no. I also think that the whole area of work that we are doing now does not at all benefit from any finger pointing. Because disaster risk reduction and prevention and mitigation is still an area of complete goodwill. I'm quite amazed. One external observer who is working with us as a very short-term consultant, he's not at all technically informed, but he walked in and out of the global platform, and afterwards he said, I have finally understood what is so different about you people. And he was thinking about the little secretariat. There are only 50 of us in Geneva. He said, it's because you're working with an area where there is an absolute sense of unity. Everyone sees disasters as the main enemy, and anything you can do to reduce the impact of that is a good thing almost. And that for me was a very interesting observation. I have never thought about it in that way. But I think we should really value this sense of unity of purpose in an otherwise the world is not terribly easy to unify around issues. So protect ourselves against any sense of that others are more accountable than I. Having said that, of course, if you take on responsibility, with it follows accountability. And we are able to talk about these things, but you actually have to nail it down to how do you ensure that you can exercise your accountability? What is it that you commit to do, and how do you do it? So be a bit more precise. Also, you hear from us, risk reduction is everyone's business. That's sort of the simplest version of it. But what the message says, as I said before, about the public and private sector, it's really the central government cannot reduce disasters in the country. It needs business. It needs cooperation with civil society, and most governments are very explicit about civil society today. They need cooperation by media. They need cooperation by science and technology. So the main challenge, as I said before, is not the lack of willingness, but how to make this work as a system without bureaucratizing it so that it loses its stamina. And that's a bit the institutional challenge, but it's also the I would say, the courage to work in very open partnerships and networks, and how to do it in such a way so that you get value and substance out of it. And sometimes as international organizations, where do we have our largest biases? Well, we have one very large bias about military, right? At least if we are humanitarian actors. If they are interested, to involve them in our thinking and make sure we have the same thoughts. They're mostly into response, but I can tell you the resilience terminology is spreading everywhere. United States is all about resilience building. Australia has a national resilience strategy framework, I think they call it. So I think that merger is there. Private sector, many of us see private sector as something we get money from, as maybe charity more than a responsibility. So that's what I mean with accountability needs to be a bit operationalized, quite frankly. So that if we get to the point where we need to hold someone more accountable than others, we know why. And there, we are not quite there yet. We can always say that a bridge was not really well built. But we have just started some work on the forensics of disasters, which we should have done 35 years ago, talking about what we should have done before. The forensics of disaster is to, when a disaster happens, do not just look at the obvious superficial causes, the storm. Actually look what happened in the environment. What were the combination of causes? Were there any faults? When were they created? And then we'll begin to understand better what in this accountability spectrum it is that we can zoom in on, I would say. But it's a very interesting area, and as I think you know that there's some work going on within the UN, with the Law Commission on an international framework. After the global platform, there's a lot of web discussion. How do we now use a rights-based approach? So suddenly everyone is very interested in the law. I am much more interested myself personally for the time being in the practice. Because I know that law grows on you in any case. From good norms, good standards, it becomes practice. But we have so much to do in just understanding what to do.
David Fisher, I'm with the Federation. And I wanted to follow up on this question about lopping people's heads off, if I could.
Oh, the discussion about what?
I'm sorry, accountability.
Yeah.
You mentioned this issue about potentially courts getting involved in holding governments and private sector accountable. But isn't really the basic type of accountability for governments, including at the local level, whether they get elected or not? And if the voters or those who are responsible would use their performance around disaster mitigation as a factor in their choices, then presumably you would have leaders who were taking it more seriously. But the question is, especially for us in the Red Cross and Red Crescent, being neutral actors, very difficult for us to enter into political campaigns. I think it's similar for the UN. Is it possible for us to use this tool or not?
Finally, should the Red Cross and Red Crescent help to motivate everyone on the climate risk framework? Yes, for sure. Because the climate risk framework is about making weather data in a reasonable time frame so you can plan not only your travel as a tourist, but also as your agriculturalist, your fisher, your businessman, available to the user. And I think the Red Cross, Red Crescent is probably one of the absolutely best placed organizations to do this. This is critical. I think if we're going to succeed with risk information and public information awareness, information needs to come from a trusted and authoritative source. Because you know there's so much in the newspapers and media misrepresent sometimes, not necessarily because of ill intention, because they misunderstand. So if we are going to increase access to good information, it needs to be trusted and authoritative. And in most countries in the world, the Red Cross, Red Crescent is an authoritative source. People do trust this organization. But it's taking on a responsibility. And of course, Norwegian Red Cross will be the first ones to support you.
It's a guest from the UK. He says, thank you for bringing up accountability and in particular personal accountability. I read recently the UK government multilateral aid review. In this review, UN ISDR performance has been rated quite poorly in terms of value for money. How would you take their recommendations to improve your work in HFA implementation?
I take it with great dignity and I agree with them. These are things that we have been working on even before they did the review. So we've done our external evaluations, we have an external audit. So we have already said that we agree with this recommendation. The one recommendation that of course I do not agree with, which the question wasn't asked, is that we shouldn't have any future. I do believe we have a very long-lasting future, in fact. And I take it as one success. You may not have seen this yet, but for me the success is that DFID and the UK government now has fully integrated disaster risk reduction into everything they do after they have gone through their external reviews. They may not think ISDR is value for money, but clearly risk reduction is value for money. And that means that they will make significant investments in countries, and that I think is a very important decision by the UK government. So a partial success in any case by ISDR, on advocacy maybe.
I think this is a global public good that we are all very much part of, and certainly the Red Cross Red Crescent movement is very much proud to be associated with it. I think what you've done today very ably is brought the subject down to earth and made everyone understand, whoever they are, wherever they are, in governments, as donors, or as ordinary citizens, or those who are just concerned about humanity, that this is one subject that has a special place on our earth, and it is true that disaster risk reduction is everyone's business. It is actually, that old-fashioned phrase is actually true more than we realize, and that maybe it is a sum total of little actions everywhere that can make the big difference. It is not something that can be done by any particular government or institution on its very much own. And what the disaster reduction movement, if I can call it that, headed by you, and you brought a lot of able leadership to that, and long may it continue, has done is to, and we saw it for ourselves at the global platform, where people quite voluntarily congregated to join the movement. So wherever they are in the world, they are part of ISDR system. That's, I think, the message back to the UK or to any others, who may have doubts in that regard. ISDR no longer belongs to you, Margareta, as an institution. It is actually, what you've done is made it such a movement that it belongs to the world. And that, I think, is the greatest achievement that you can do, because it affects the future of the world. Thank you, Margareta Wahlström.